Welcome to Under the Microscope. I am your host, Jenny Germano. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I am really excited about this next topic that we're going to be diving into. Today, we're going to be talking about asset light, market ready strategic expansion for cannabis operators. I have a very special guest today. And so I'll get to that here in a moment. I just want to give a little bit of background about myself. I got my start in the cannabis industry in 2009 here in Denver, Colorado, and I was running and operating a vertically integrated cannabis operations for 6 years. And in 2015, I founded my company, 𝗖𝗍𝗄𝗃 Consulting, and I've been helping operators navigate compliance and launching their businesses across the United States. So let's go ahead and give a warm welcome to my next guest, Xavier Jaillet. Xavier is an associate attorney at McDonald's Hopkins Law Firm here in Colorado, and he also is the chair of the Colorado chapter and secretary of the board for the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. He's a busy guy. Xavier, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about your background? Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. No, thanks for having me. I'm very excited for today's conversation. Hopefully, it'll be informative for some of your listeners, and it can help maybe some licensed cannabis operators figure out ways to access some new potential and increase their revenue streams.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, I am a associate attorney. I'm actually just recently became an attorney this year. I've spent about, geez, it's 2025, so 13 years or so in the cannabis industry up until this point. I got started in 2012 as a bud tender. Found myself as a college student. I was tired of the typical summer jobs that you do as a college student, flipping burgers, making pizzas, delivering food, whatever it is. And let's just say I've had a lifelong passion, maybe not lifelong, but a long passion for cannabis, definitely a personal consumer. And I found myself as a college student up in Boulder, Colorado. And I was like, I can go do this job that's boring and not really exciting and engaging, or I could go sell weed. So applied to a few dispensaries and was fortunate enough to be selected as a bud tender back at 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗃 Station up in Boulder
Yeah.
in 2012. And so worked in retail cannabis for about 2 years, got to the point where retail's fun. It's nice to engage with the patients and help people select products and discover new and exciting things for their cannabis consumption journeys. But at a certain point, I wanted to move into more of an operational role. And so I ended up working in extraction labs actually for about 3, 4 years, doing a whole variety of roles from packaging to running the extraction machines and the closed loop systems to eventually moving into a little bit more of a managerial position where I found myself as the director of operations for a fairly small startup at the time, 5 to 6 employee extraction brand. So did that for a little bit, really enjoyed that work. And then around 2016, 2017, I'd say I became a little disillusioned, let's say, with cannabis, the industry generally at that point. I had at least the license side. My experience had been that I was finding myself running businesses and not being compensated, let's say, in ways that I thought was
Yeah.
appropriate at that time, which in hindsight, I was young and a little headstrong, and maybe that wasn't the right approach or thought process, but it led me to actually moving into ancillary sales for software companies. And so I did that for quite some time in the cannabis space, worked for HR and payroll company, a product safety company, and then eventually said, hey, I had the LSAT, which is the law school admission test. I'd taken that in 2016 and did nothing with my score. And so those expire after 5 years. And right at the 5 year mark, I said, hey, maybe I should do something with that. And I dusted it off and went to law school and then
Crazy.
pivoted to the legal industry. Yeah,
Uh,
not a very common path, but I'm very happy to
no.
be here.
That's amazing. That's an incredible journey. I don't meet a lot of attorneys that have that experience at all whatsoever. And not only that, you were like bud tending, extraction, a packager, and then you went into software and then HR and all these different things, all these different tentacles that kind of come in and touch every aspect of the industry. And it makes you a very unique attorney. You can see both sides, not only what you have to do as far as attorney, but I think you might understand some of their pain points even more, I would
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, I think that exactly like you said. I think the best attorneys out there, whether it's cannabis or any other industry, are ones that truly understand what their clients are going through. And then more importantly, what legal advice, how that actually impacts business operations or day-to-day life of a client, and beyond just it could be this, it might be that. Lawyers always get the bad rap of never saying
Yeah.
anything definitive, right? But I like to go in a little bit more of a hybrid lawyer, advisor, looking at the holistic picture of the business and to try to help clients really find solutions to problems that are not only feasible to attain, but are ones that are going to help them grow their business, right, and succeed. Yeah.
That's incredible. I'm going to go ahead and dive in. And just a reminder, we're going to be talking about asset light, market ready, strategic expansion for cannabis operators. And the first area, we're going to talk about three predominant models for state licensed products.
Yeah, certainly. And I appreciate you teeing that up. I think the current, let's say, state of affairs for the cannabis industry, as I'm assuming all the listeners that might be tuning in know about, is that cannabis right now is really a state by state system. So you've got each state with its own set of regulations and regulatory body and licensing requirements and all sorts of things that differ from state to state. And if you find yourself potentially on the border of Colorado and Utah, for example, you could drive 5 minutes and find yourself in a state where there is no cannabis. Adult use
Yep.
consumption is entirely illegal. At the same time, while Utah might not be one of them, the majority of states now do have some form of cannabis program. So whether that's medical or recreational. And so I think it's a challenge for brands that find their footing, their success in their home market to start to grow outside of the boundaries of the state they find themselves in. A lot of times you might end up being what we call an SSO, a single state operator, where you
Yeah.
could have your retail 5, 6 locations in your state, you're a well-recognized brand, but then you realize that, okay, my options for growth are I can try to have a dispensary on every street corner or try to grow into new remote areas of the state, if you will. But at a certain point, there's a cap there, right?
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to states, Colorado is I don't know if there's not a moratorium right now, I don't believe, on licensing. So Colorado is an open license state. So there's no kind of fixed cap on how many licenses the marijuana enforcement division will issue. And correct me if I'm wrong on that one, because you might know more than me.
I was going to say there's caps at the local level.
Right.
That's where the
Certainly.
caps come in. Yeah, like for Denver, you can't just apply for a new license in Denver. I believe the market is capped. You have to buy an existing license. And then some of the smaller towns like Brighton, which just recently opened this past year,
Right.
they had a ban. A lot of these small towns are lifting bans after 10 years, and you could only go after 4 dispensary licenses. Some of them are still opting out for grows. They're only allowing dispensaries and nothing else, 2 or 3 or whatever that town does. So they're still capping the smaller towns.
Yeah. And again, what that leads to, of course, is a limit on your ability to expand and grow from a
Yeah.
business owner perspective. And so, what I thought would be a good topic for us to discuss today, and something that you and I consulted a little bit on, is really talking about opportunities for brands, for licensed operators to find ways to bring their products into new markets. And so, typically, the way that I like to approach this or talk about it is that there are these kind of what I would call three buckets, three approaches that come to expanding your brand, your license operation outside of a state. I think the first one I'd call is expansion by license acquisition.
Yeah.
This is emblematic of the 2016, 2017 era of cannabis, where the only valuation of a cannabis company was how many licenses it held. So
Sure.
all the big guys out there were going state by state and applying as much as they could and
Oh,
submitting all
yeah.
the applications. And we had these large MSOs with of licenses.
Yeah, it
And that
sure
just
did.
ultimately didn't become a feasible model. But I think that's still an opportunity, right? So a cannabis company that wants to expand can say, okay, I'm in Colorado. I want to have my products in Michigan. I can go buy real estate or lease real estate, apply for a license. If I get issued, then I'm off to the races in that state. I think there's some limitations to that model
Yeah.
because there's cost, first of all, I think is the biggest issue, right? If you are going after a new license, the licensing fees are expensive, real estate's costly, and just the price to stand up a cannabis business is not for the faint of heart, I'll put it that way. So it can be a challenge, especially for some smaller brands that are just getting started that are looking for these expansion opportunities. I think The second bucket or approach to expanding a brand would be expansion by business purchase, right? So
Yeah.
going after an existing business, trying to buy the existing business, whether or not you're buying just the assets or you're purchasing the license as a standalone license, which can be difficult in some states because many states require the license to be tied to a specific company or a specific property. So it can be very tough to go after existing businesses and be able to flourish and find the same success you find in your home state. One thing I think that is good and bad in this category is that the cannabis industry has been in a struggling position, I think, for some time now. So it's not out of the question to find, what I would call relatively cheap operations to go purchase and help the initial operator get a little payday and get them out of the business and then take their business over. And I think that's something that I'm sure on a regular basis is working with companies that maybe do have a history of metric violations. That affects their purchase price and it also affects the willingness of a expanding brand to come in and purchase that asset because it comes with some burdens, right? There's some baggage attached. So that can be a difficult strategy in
Yeah.
that regard. And then I would say the third strategy, and one that I think is increasingly becoming popular and being adopted by a lot of cannabis brands, is pivoting or launching parallel brand channels in the hemp industry. So we see a lot of, I think of 1906 here in Colorado, right? One of the
Yeah.
long-standing edible companies that I think it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe. They came out, made a formal announcement, said, hey, we're shuttering our license operations in Colorado, and we're only going to be selling hemp-derived THC products to consumers in the US. So I think that's increasingly a channel and an option that brands and companies are taking advantage of, but it's still one that's fraught with risk. It seems every day there's a new news story about some state shuttering the ability for companies to sell hemp-derived products in those states. We certainly see news on a regular basis at the federal level coming from updates to the 2018 Farm Bill, right, which is the initial legislation
Yeah.
that kind of opened the door for all of this. And so something that's I think people are cautiously moving into, but does remain an option. And I think there's some benefit to it. Online sales are certainly more possible. We can reach consumers in states that don't have licensed marijuana
Yeah.
markets, licensed cannabis markets. So I think it's something worth considering. But I also understand that there's still heartburn and a contingent of the cannabis industry, if you will, that sees that as competition and kind of sees that as taking the easy route, right? Licensed cannabis operators, they pay hefty taxes. They have to pay hefty licensing fees. They have to deal with regulation, to hire stellar consultants like yourself to come in and help them navigate those regulations and move away from again, the lawyer speak where a lawyer can regulation
Mhm.
is, whereas a consultant like yourself can come in and actually put that practice into play for a company. So I'd say there's still challenges to that. And the last bucket, and kind of the one that I think we're going to spend the most time talking about today, is really expansion by licensing agreements. Is, for lack of a better term, not the sexiest title, of course, but I think it's one that presents one of the best opportunities for licensed cannabis brands and companies to expand into new states.
Yeah, and I think those were all really good. I do know people that are buying up distressed assets, and it's still a risk because are you getting the whole location? Are you just buying the license? Are you just buying the IP? What exactly are you doing with that distressed asset? Because I think there's parts like Colorado, for example, there's areas that are very saturated and you have more competition. But once you start going into the outer part of the states where there's less dispensaries and you're closer to other borders of other states like Nebraska or Kansas or any of these places, you could find probably some pretty good success, but those places are capped, right? They might have 2 or 3 licenses, and they won't go beyond that. I know we're gonna talk a lot about this with the licensing agreements, and that's the route I'm seeing a lot of people go now. When I talk to a lot of these companies in Colorado, and I see them in Missouri or Michigan or all these other places or New Jersey, and they're doing exactly what you're talking about. They're partnered with somebody.
Some of the capped markets where, Alabama, for example, I think those what, 4 vertically integrated medical licenses that I don't even think have been stood up yet, last I checked. But to them, then that the opportunity is, oh, you become a darling in the room. And all of a sudden, all these brands from other states are looking at you and saying, oh, you've got a license to operate in this state. We want to work with you. So I think it's really interesting kind of seeing the evolution of people's approach to expansion that way.
Yeah, when I was in the Missouri market, I thought, "Oh my gosh, look at all these Colorado brands here in
Mhm.
Missouri." I believe there's some other states in there. I'm not sure which ones, maybe Oregon or Washington or maybe
Yeah.
Arizona. I'm not 100% sure. I just always noticed the Colorado ones, and that's what they did. They partnered because Missouri is a very capped market, and it's a very successful market because it is capped. And that's also something to think about is, do you wanna go into a market that's a free for all? Because it could eventually end up like happening in Colorado or Washington or Michigan or New Mexico or these places that are struggling right now.
California. Yeah.
Or yeah, California, or are you gonna make the decision to say, "Why don't I partner with somebody in a market that's capped?" I wanna do this deep dive now with expansion by licensing agreements. Let's start with the good, and I guess we'll start with access to new markets.
Yeah. I think always lead with the sweet and then we can finish on maybe some of the sour. But I
Okay.
think the main push and our main reason to do this is truly access to new markets, like we've been discussing. I think at a certain point, you reach your limitation in a market. You potentially have a reputation you've developed, good or bad, that can make it difficult to continue doing business in a state. And this allows you to really tap into new fertile territory, we'll say. I think the logical kind of next piece of that, of course, is access to new consumers, which can be something that people don't really think about is the impact that state regulations have on consumer channels. What are states doing as far as promoting, say, more sensible product consumption, right? What are states doing to develop and promote product development itself? Some states are going to be a little more favorable in a regulation perspective to R&D, to testing new product forms and formulations on the market, while other states are going to be fairly restrictive when it comes to doing that. So I think that's another big benefit is moving into a new state and potentially trying some of the things that you were previously unable to do in your home market. So I think those two are very interesting approaches.
Yeah.
Mm. I think another big reason to consider doing, we'll call this asset light licensing, branding, expansion is just the CapEx involved with license acquisition expansion. Like we talked about at the top of the pod, there's costs and challenges involved with purchasing an existing business or going after a new round of licenses and applying for them yourself. Number one thing, of course, always being money. And going into a state where you have a partner with an existing facility, a pre-established license, potentially existing consumer and customer relations, they can be really beneficial to someone to step into that model, that mold, and experience success from day one instead of having to really go through the grind, the hustle, the blood, sweat, and tears of standing a brand up in a new state. So I think that's another major benefit.
So you use the word CapEx in case
Hmm.
somebody might not know what that means.
Yeah, it's capital expenditures.
It's
Yeah, no, I think it's important to make sure that we're level setting with abbreviations and things that I might throw around. They're common knowledge, but they're not. And so
okay.
CapEx covers everything from purchasing initial equipment, from a packaging table to an extraction machine, to building out a retail space. All these things require a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's capital expenditures for the company. And so it can be difficult if you don't have, often it's in the millions, right? The requirement to really get a legitimate company and brand stood up in a state can be very expensive. Shoving that onto someone else and having someone else take care of that, and then stepping into their newly built facility and producing your products can be a much more cost effective way to expand.
The other good thing about stepping into this already existing facility that's been built out already is licensed, and let's just say they've already passed their inspections. One, you have the facility, you have the employees that are already there, so already got the foundation and structure built, and then you have distribution relationships and
Yes.
equipment. And so I don't know if you want to expand on any of those.
Yeah, I think distribution relationships, they can be dicey. We'll talk about them later in the context, I think, of potentially being bad for someone looking to expand to a new state.
We have a dicey
Right.
section.
Yeah, we do have the dicey, the bad and the ugly,
It gets
but
a little
trying to do the
spicy
good, the
near the
bad, the
end.
ugly. Right.
Yeah.
But truly, if it's a legitimate licensee, right, a company that does have good reputation, has a strong sales force, does have a deep Rolodex of connections to existing customers in the state, oftentimes you can take advantage of that. There might be some costs involved, or you might be sharing your revenue with that partner a little bit for their services. But at the end of the day, it can really jumpstart your expansion into a new market. Those distribution relationships are very key, especially for obviously new brands. I think the other good piece, the reason why you'd want to do this is costs of labor, taking advantage of someone else's employees that do understand perhaps the nuances, the regulations in that particular market, that are familiar with existing customers. And then you can tap into that knowledge, that kind of intangible knowledge, and then use that to your advantage.
Yeah, I also have revenue growth and brand growth down too as one of the good parts of jumping into this type of structuring.
Yeah, far too often I talk to owners and business operators that get off the ground and they're talking about how from 4 to 8 a.m. they're in the facility cranking out some products. From 8 to 5, they're on the road trying to develop customer relationships. And then from 5 to midnight, they're reconciling their books and inputting all their metrics, changes and things for the day. And so it can be a difficult path to take to do it on your own. So yeah, having the ability to tap into those existing knowledge sources is really helpful.
It is challenging to do it on your own. I know a lot of people that do it. It's a double-edged sword, right? There's pros and cons to doing it by yourself, and there's pros and cons to having a partner. I do not think there is the absolute, I don't think there's any way, any certain path that you can go on that won't come with a challenge. That doesn't exist in the cannabis industry. I always like to
Yeah,
remind
no.
everyone the cannabis industry is like climbing these mountain peaks. There's ups and downs, there's peaks and valleys, and all that stuff going on. So, we're going to get to this next section, which is the ugly of it all, the spicy, ugly section. And we're going to first start with all the things that can come up with partner selection and kind of some realities that exist out there.
Yeah. I think that's probably the hurdle or potentially the biggest thing stopping more brands from doing this is difficult conditions to find a partner that you trust, not only to be a business partner and to uphold their end of the bargain, but to represent your brand in the market adequately in the same way that you would, to produce products at the same level of standards that you would in your own facility, to interact with customers the same way that you would. All these things really become the key terms a lot of the time of the ultimate agreement between the expanding brand and then the licensed brand in the state that they're expanding into. I do want to pause. I mentioned agreement there. I think that one thing I want to make sure we impart on listeners is I can't recommend enough, and this is not a biased take from a lawyer, but I want you all to be papering your agreements as much as you can. Handshake deals, they're great. Everyone is honeymoon period for everybody always goes well, right? And then cracks begin to show in production, or all of a sudden, money that you were expecting is no longer hitting your bank account. And that's when you really want to have that written signed agreement to be able to fall back on and enforce your rights and be able to say, hey, this is what we agreed to a year ago. Nothing's changed. Please continue to honor that agreement.
I would also chime in and say, and this is what I've learned over 16 years of doing this, is a lot of times cracks show up because things weren't communicated properly. How often are you going back to that agreement? Are you actually having the meetings that you said in the agreement that you were going to have as the executive level and ownership of the company? Are you meeting quarterly? Are you hashing out all the issues and talking about how to solve problems? Is every job assigned to somebody in that company? Or is it floating around out there and someone just assuming somebody's going to take care of it and it's actually not getting dealt with? I find a lot of the times that's when things begin to fall apart and crack in these businesses. I think a healthy business, obviously, there are going to be problems to solve, but I think communication is the key. Every successful business has to work through things and things come up. But a good partnership is really getting together and communicating and making sure that you're talking about all these things and not like pitting each other against each other. And then you're having to get attorneys involved and maybe you're needing mediation and then obviously further down the road, but where everyone's breaking up and not happy. So it is something to take very seriously when you're doing these agreements and making sure. I say the handshake, unfortunately, needs to go away. I think you should still have a paper agreement and then you shake their hand afterwards. But just doing it on handshaking, there's probably, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 people in Colorado who did a bunch of handshakes 16 years ago, and they would probably tell you don't do it
Right.
because they will tell you some horror stories because that's what Colorado was. Nobody had agreements. Everybody said, "Hey, you're my best friend. Let's go do this." Yeah. And now, years later, they're in court suing each other for millions of dollars because there was no
Yeah.
agreement in place. You really have to be careful. Are you
And the
able to?
real there is just, it's always the attorneys, right? The attorneys end up taking their fees, and then someone's walking away with maybe a little bit of money at the end of the day. And again, coming from the attorney perspective, I can't recommend enough that people avoid litigation, mediation, all the things that do come out of the bad breakup, because those things are very expensive.
Yeah, I just don't think there's ever a winner, honestly. But like you said, the attorneys are pretty much the only ones that win, and both parties are going to lose because it's going to cost you something. It could cost you your health, it can cost you relationships, it's going to cost you money. If you could also talk about partner selection, payment structure, equipment, and sales and distributions, and the different range of agreements. That was a lot I
Yeah.
just threw at you.
No, but that's good. I think I appreciate you moving this along, because I could get stuck on one topic and talk about it for hours. And I know we're trying to make something really informative and educational for the listeners.
Yeah.
So yeah, on starting with payment structure, I think one of the first things that you need to consider when you're going into a license relationship, a branding relationship with an operator in another state, is, how people are going to get paid. I think for a long time there was an expectation, especially from some of the larger, more successful brands, that they would go into a market and it would be a royalty agreement. Some license, oh my God, I really want to sell Cheech and Chong, to throw a name out there, right? These names that have pedigree. And the Cheech and Chong, the edible brand, can go to a state and say, I've selected you as my partner. Now you're going to pay me to be able to sell my products into the state. Unfortunately, I don't think that's often the case for the majority of operators. The majority of operators will go into a state and say, "Hey, I'm in every store in Colorado, and my revenue numbers are great. Consumers love my product." And the licensed partner will say, "Okay, we've got hundreds of gummy brands here in our state. We've got a bunch of different vapes and whatever it is. You need to pay for us to be able to make your product and just in the state." And so a lot of the time, it's really the gravitas, the weight of the brand itself, that can determine how that structure ends up going. But then there's also nuances between royalty percentages, right? Is someone on we'll call it the white labeler, right? The licensed
Yeah.
operation. Is someone on the white labeling side, the contract manufacturing side, are they doing all the sales? If so, that company, that license, that white labeler is going to be looking for a cut of revenue, most likely. Or is it just the expanding brand is going into their facility from midnight to 8 a.m.? They're using it when the existing brands are not operating in there, and they're really just taking advantage of the license. That's going to be a little bit of a cheaper relationship for that expanding brand. They still have to have the staff in place. They still have to make sure that they're pulling in equipment. They're buying infused inputs. They're buying non-infused inputs, kind of thing. So there's really a sliding scale and a wide range of different ways that I think, these agreements and kind of the payment structure terms themselves can be fleshed out. For listeners, I think the message here is to not take everything that you're given at face value. You can certainly push back, and there's levers that you can pull. So if you want to say, yeah, okay, you do all of our manufacturing, you take care of the packaging, you put everything in a nice final form as far as packaging is concerned, and then we'll hire someone in state to do all sales and distribution. I often find that to be a great relationship, because the salesperson understands the brand, they can represent it appropriately, and they're not competing with their existing brands and being a portfolio hustler, if you will, right? Where you've got 10 different brands and three of them are gummies and three of them are vapes, and to figure out ways to sell all of them at the same time. It's a challenge. So I think that can be one way to really make a successful expansion remain successful, is by handling sales and distribution. The other thing is equipment that you mentioned, right? So
Yeah.
what sort of equipment is actually going to be used in the production of a product? Is it going to be something that the contract manufacturer has in place? Maybe. But if you have a very custom product formulation or custom product form, if you're a drink, for example, not every contract manufacturer is going to have canning capabilities. If you want to
Yeah.
put your drink in a can, you might need to foot the bill for them to purchase canning equipment. or you might lease it to them, or you might provide them with initial money for them to go buy one themselves, and then they're paying it back to you. And so there's a lot of different ways to approach the equipment problem, but I think that's something that far too often people don't think about. And good equipment, it can often be the difference between a good product or a bad product.
I know a lot of people like to buy used equipment, but it requires a lot of maintenance and making sure that you can fix it or the parts are even still available. If you bought something that's old, some people buy these ancient things, and do they even still make the parts to fix it?
Right?
Did
Does
you
the
go ahead
company
and just
exist?
spend? Yeah, does the company still exist? Can you actually get the information that you need? And sometimes I think trying to save money can actually cost you money. And so people need to be careful with that. I do have a question. How would I vet a partner? If I was going to do this and try looking for a partner,
I think the legal piece is somewhat straightforward. Are they a good actor? Are they in good standing? Do they have their license? Those are relatively easy boxes to check, I would say. Financials can be the same, right? You gain access to someone's financials to kind of understand, okay, are they a company that's just bleeding money left and right and they're looking to bring me in as a partner to really just stand their business up? Or are they successful in other channels and they're someone that I can rely on to continue being successful? But I think the most important thing, and this is probably somewhere that a consultant like yourself would come in, is really physical, putting eyes on the facility, meeting the partners, going beyond just the email exchange and the phone call and the Zoom call, and going out to dinner, talking to them and understanding whether or not your values and their values, and then by values, I don't mean religious beliefs, right? More business values and approach to
yeah,
operating their business. I think that that's one of the most important things to do is fly out to the state, visit the facility, meet the general manager, meet the
yeah.
owner. So important.
I think values is a good one too. I have somebody I work with, and we share the similar core values when it comes to executing services. And we like to be thorough and we're system oriented and we document everything. Those are things that are really important to us. We don't want to be sloppy or anything like that. And that might not be important to another person. So you kind of have to think about just to find out like what are their core values around business and what's important to them. I also too, I wanna throw it out there for those that are thinking about or attempting to do something like this. It's important to hire somebody, a third party person to come in to do an audit, due diligence audit. And you can do obviously the due diligence audit on the financial side, and you can work with the CPA and you can have them do an audit of the books. But really you want somebody coming in and auditing the facility, finding out what are the compliance gaps, what are the issues, do you think the employees are trained properly? How are they handling their SOPs and engagement? Are they following material change laws? Because a lot of times people forget about material changes. And then what's their seed to sale tracking? And what's the shape it is in, right? Are you inheriting a mess? Are there things going on that you don't know about and that you're going to then inherit and that could affect your brand? I've talked with people who have teamed up with other people, got in there, got their product in there, and that facility got shut down and they lost access to all their product. And the regulators came in, everything got seized and they lost everything that they had in the facility. So it really is important to make sure you're partnering with the right people and that you are doing a full operational audit and seed to sale audit of that company as well.
Yeah, so important. And the parties, they enter these relationships with rose tinted glasses. They're saying, hey, I really want to expand into this state, and this partner's got a license, and they seem to be great. They're saying all the things I want them to say. And you ignore the warning signs. And so, yeah, having an independent person come in and do that due diligence is so important.
Yeah, I'm gonna say something that I've been saying since 2015, which is red flags never turn green. They
Right.
don't. A red flag will not all of a sudden turn green. It's not purple. It's like it's red. It's not gonna change a different color. And those rose-colored glasses that you're talking about, people just get caught up in the glamour. It's just so crazy how people they lose all their common sense. It's like their decision-making process gets fogged a little bit and they don't see the flags. But once everything hits the fan and let's just say the ship goes down and everything falls apart, people that I talk to will say, "Oh yeah, I saw the red flags. I just ignored them. I get
Right.
told that all the time. They saw them, they knew, they had a gut feeling, and they ignored it. So it's just something to think about. And is any good stuff around like IP? Because a lot of people can fight over intellectual property, like the best way to protect yourself. What about your recipes? What if you have special things that you're doing and the relationship falls apart? Like, how can they protect their intellectual property?
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to the written agreement, right? Making sure that you're clearly defining who owns what, who's going to be responsible for what. I find oftentimes some of the most successful relationships are ones where the expanding brand provides everything except for the infused input, because obviously you need a license for that, right? So they're providing non-infused ingredients, they're providing packaging, providing
Yeah.
labeling, they're handling marketing materials. You do everything that's outward facing, and then your partner is essentially a licensed facility for you to operate out of or to manufacture your product. So I think that's super critical. I think the most successful brands really retain control over all of that and make sure that they're the ones that are owning, again, the IP itself. I think the other thing is to if you are going to be licensing IP to someone, make sure that you have the ability to go in and audit and to say, oh, okay, 3 months ago you were doing X, Y, Z, but your standards have slipped a little bit. So now I'm going to come in and retrain your staff, right?
Yeah.
Or
100%.
update your labels, whatever it is. So I think that's all very critical. And then I think the real kind of secret sauce to all of this comes in with IP, because at the end of the day, you can own a cannabis brand without having any licenses. You can be truly the fully asset light model where you have a good idea, you've got a strong brand, maybe a good formulation for a product, and then everything else is handled through partnership relationships.
Wow.
And that can be a way for, especially early stage startups, to do some A/B testing, fix what
Mm.
doesn't, before they go out and, going back to that CapEx word, spend a bunch of money and find themselves in the hole and owing people a lot of debt. And then, God forbid, their plans don't flesh out the way they thought it would, a failed business. So
Yeah.
I think IP licensing is really the secret sauce to all this.
And just to remind listeners that I think it's like 75% of businesses fail in the first 5 years. That's just regular businesses. They're not even regulated cannabis in that stat out there. So then we're going to add all these layers of this crazy regulated cannabis market, which is still, we're still very immature. People forget this. I mean, I know it's been going on in a while and it's expanding. We're still in our infancy stage. We're not even teenagers yet in the cannabis industry. We're not even like in our tweens yet. So there's still a lot of growth challenges and it's going to continue for a while. And we don't even know what's going to happen federally. And even if something does happen federally, we don't even know what that's going to look like for this whole entire industry. We could try to say we know what it's going to look like, but you don't really know. And so it's just things to think about, which kind of brings me into like my next section, which is the bad, which is we just did ugly, just so you know. That was just the ugly section, and now we're in the bad. So this is just the pitfalls, and I always like to talk about the pitfalls on my show. I think it's really important. I'm a firm believer in bringing people out of the fantasy of cannabis and bringing them into the reality. That's my job. That's what I do for a living. I'm a compliance person, so I am a bubble popper. And so on this show, we like to bring people out of the fantasy and into the reality of what's going on out there. So first, we're going to talk about pitfalls around used written agreements.
Yeah. So I think some of this will be a bit of a recap.
Yeah.
But I think it's always important to finish on some of the most important things for listeners and potential brand operators that are looking to expand to consider. And so the first is using written agreements, making
Yeah.
sure that all these things that you're talking about, whether or not it's sales goals or access to the facility or where your product is going to be stored in the facility, because sometimes a partner could say, hey, this is just my partner from another state. We don't really care about their packaging or their infused products. We're just going to shove them under the stairs somewhere. Harry
Mm.
Potter treatment. So I think that's super important, because then you have something to fall back on. If, again, the breakup does start to happen, the cracks begin to show, you can go back to that and always say, okay, this is a level setting moment. This is what we agreed to. Let's honor the agreement. And then again, if you do ultimately find yourself, unfortunately, in some form of mediation or litigation, the written agreement is going to be really the strongest piece of evidence on the table as far as what you agree to, because the he said, she said is never going to end up well for anybody. But even written agreements, terms are up for interpretation. What I say is blue, you might think is red, right? So I think it's very interesting how looking at that dynamic. It's really the first place to start. To use written agreements and make sure you're honoring those. Don't agree to anything you can't do.
Yeah,
So
make sure everything you say you're going to do, that you can actually execute it too. And once again, that audit piece is really important, because let's just say you're a Colorado brand and you expanded into New Jersey, and maybe you sent some of your key people out there to get everyone trained and get it set up and all that. And then once you get through all that, you step back and they come back to Colorado and it's out there running. How do you know what's going on in that facility? I always tell business owners, you can't just turn over your facility to the employees in this industry. How do you know exactly what they're doing if you're not auditing them, if you're not checking on them? So you should be going out there and just making sure, like these quality control checks, like you were saying, are they doing the recipes correctly? Is packaging look the right way? What's the quality control looking like? Are they following all of our QMS procedures that we put together, that these systems that we want followed? And if you're not checking on those things and you're not being diligent, things can happen. What if they get violations that could negatively affect your brand because you're operating out of that facility that just got big violations, even if your part did not get violations, if they got it within the facility, it could negatively affect your brand and your reputation.
yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue to the next point I really want to hammer home, which is really defining the allocation of liability. If that investigation happens and if there are contaminated products or employees taking some products out the back door, how does that impact the expanding brand and their ability to operate in that state? Who's covering the costs of those fines and fees? Are you able to go into the facility and recapture some of your packaging and your labels and products if there is a recall or some sort of containment procedure where products are no longer able to be pulled out of that facility? These are all things that are super important to define upfront because, again, when the cracks show, the license partner, the contract manufacturer, oftentimes they're going to start defending their own interests far more than they're going to be concerned about their partners. And so, a good way to protect yourself as you're expanding to new states is to really allocate that liability and say, yeah, if your license is suspended and we all of a sudden we're having a great year and then it's April, 420 is around the corner. All of a sudden, we can't get any products out of your facility to meet, hopefully, increased sales during that. Who's paying for that? Who's paying for that lost revenue? So those are super important terms to define clearly. And I mentioned lost revenue. Another thing to really
Yeah.
clearly define is the economics, right? Who's paying for what's the percentage that, you're paying someone? Is it on a per unit produced basis? Is it a percentage of all sales made? Is it an hourly or a daily or a monthly, just like lease or fee that you're paying them? These are all things to really clearly define up front so that again, you've got that to fall back on if, the cracks are showing.
Yeah.
So
That's really good. Essentially, it sounds like these agreements, that facility is really your co-packer. I'm going to be working with a co-packer who has that distribution, and they're going to be actually putting together my product. So it's just something to think about. And then let's see, the too good to be true. That's a good one. That's a good
yeah.
one.
And I think that goes back to again those rose tinted glasses, especially when it comes to the cannabis industry and the fact that so many of these markets are infant markets, right? It might be one that turned online last year. This person that you're talking to might be one of 5 operations that are actually operational in that market. And you're like, if they're operational, there must be something good going on. I've been in this industry for quite some time, like you, and I think we both, I'm sure, have plenty of war stories of dealing with people that to your face might be super friendly and cordial, but they're ready to stab you behind your back,
Oh,
or
yeah.
they're ready to, again, put their interests before yours.
Yeah.
And because it's just a new market, because it is cannabis, it's this legacy market that for a long time was illegal and quite frankly still is, and was controlled and operated a lot by criminal elements. I think sometimes some of that, approach to business unfortunately does come forward a little bit more in the
It
cannabis industry than it would
does.
in traditional industries.
It does.
So I think it's something that's super important, because if it is too good to be true, it probably is. And then you're going to be the one paying for that down the road.
Yeah, it's the nature of the cannabis industry. Like I said, we're still at the very beginning. There are bad actors out there. That's why it is important that you do your research, you vet, you do your due diligence, and that you make sure you have the right attorney helping you and that you're just not doing handshakes. It's just a risk. If you're doing it, just know that we're in a risky business. This is already a risk adverse industry. And then now you're adding more risk on top of it already being risky. So it's something to think about. In wrapping up, I just want to make sure we cover if there's anything around starting low and going slow, and then a little control over infused input quality that we need to hammer out before we wrap everything up here.
Yeah. So I'll start with little control. I think I kind of want to end on the start low, go slow, because I think it's a funny anecdote to apply to businesses. But one thing to really consider is that because of the way state regulations work, you have to have a license in every state that you're dealing with infused inputs, infused products. So the person that has the control over where those inputs are coming from, how they're being manufactured, that's the license partner. So the person that holds the license can decide what kind of extract inputs they want to put into your product. And of course, you can put protections in place in your agreement to say, well, you'll use the highest quality THC distillate, for example, for our
Yeah.
products. But at the end of the day, that's the person that has the license is the one that really has full control of that. And if something does go wrong in their facility or with their license, those inputs often are the most expensive part of your product. And if you've already paid for those inputs and they're sitting at your partner's facility and they get shut down for some reason, then, that's a lot of money out the door. So I think something to consider, and something, again, to contract around and make sure you have the right language in your contracts and agreements in place, is how, that infused inputs, the THC, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
the cannabinoids in your product, are being handled and controlled.
The start low
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, I think it's funny because everyone always recommends with cannabis consumption, you start low, you go slow, right? Don't jump to the 100 milligram gummy right away. Start with 2.5 and then see how you feel after a few hours. Kind of ramp yourself up into that place. And I think that anecdote really does apply to business agreements and business relationships as well, where you might want to have the urge of Missouri, for example. There's a lot of hype around the market.
Yeah.
Minnesota is another great example, where news every day coming out of revenue and consumer numbers breaking records, regulations being very favorable to businesses. So you can be kind of excited and want to jump into that market right away and throw all your eggs in that basket. But it's going to make you more successful if you start low and you go slow. But you find a partner that's checking all the boxes, but then you have them only produce a few hundred units per month and you see how those sell. And then you can ramp up from there. If you're throwing all your money in one place initially, that money might disappear. That can often be the difference between success and failure.
Yeah. That's how they trained us in dispensaries. Start off low and slow, a little bit at a time. And you don't want to be like Maureen Dowd. I don't know if anyone remembers that from 2014. A New York Times reporter came to Colorado and did an editorial on the legal adult use market and ate a whole entire 100 milligram cannabis chocolate bar and ended up in a fetal position. So that you don't want to end up in a fetal position in this business with your partnerships or how things are going. It's really important to have a process and be well thought out about everything. I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much, Xavier. You were an amazing guest. I think this was a great topic. I definitely would like to have you back in the future because I think we could talk about some more stuff here. And I really think this is going to help everyone. So I really appreciate you being here.
I appreciate you having me on. Hopefully we were able to make potentially a dry legal topic into something a little bit more exciting and easy to listen to. And I really do think that for the listeners out there that are considering this, I think it is a great opportunity for you to expand into new markets. And I'll say, if anyone has any questions or wants to contact me, they can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the best way to do it, actually.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be, I'm sure my name will be somewhere in the podcast.
It will. Yeah, I'll have that information. So that brings me to my next section. If you're really interested, I am streaming on Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and all the streaming apps out there. That's Under the Microscope with Jenny. And also, I have a YouTube channel. So go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That has been fun doing that channel. I will actually have Xavier's information posted in the description box on the episode. So if you would like to find out more information about what he's up to and what's going on and how to connect with him, and also if you would like to connect with me as well. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I appreciate everyone tuning in to Under the Microscope with Jenny every week. Thank you.